Greetings, Western Civ 1. This lecture, we're going to be talking about the Christian church in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. Now, you may recognize this map. This is the Holy Land. See Jerusalem right there? So this is the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Egypt down here. If I pull back, no, I can't do that. But here we have Jerusalem. Here's Damascus in Syria. This is the city of Antioch. Now, you may never have heard of Antioch before, but Antioch was a major city of the Roman world and the Eastern Mediterranean basin. It was, in fact, the third largest city in the Roman Empire. The largest, of course, was Rome, with nearly 1 million people. But here's the second largest, Alexandria, Egypt. Founded by Alexander the Great around the year 328 BC. Antioch was founded a few decades later, a decade and a half later, I'd say, by one of the generals of Alexander the Great, named Antiochus, and he named it after himself, just how Alexandria was named after Alexander the Great. But these were the second and third largest cities in the Roman Empire after Rome. Jerusalem was not a terribly large city. It had only something on the order of 100,000 people in it. But because it was the holy city of Christianity, it was very important in the early Christian church. In fact, in this map, you can see 4 of the 5 most important churches in the Roman world and in the early Middle Ages. Jerusalem was what was called a patriarchate. A patriarch is a ruling father. And so the bishops who controlled all the churches in this area were called patriarchs. The archbishops who controlled all the churches in the Holy Land were called the patriarchs of Jerusalem. The bishops of Alexandria, Egypt, controlled all the churches in Egypt. And so they were called the patriarchs of Egypt. All the churches in Syria were controlled by the bishops of Antioch, the patriarchs of Antioch. And this, of course, is Constantinople, right here on the Bosphorus. Remember that Constantine had this city built. It had its founding celebration in 330 AD as a Christian city. And this was the great capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was also known as Byzantium, its old Greek name, pre-Christian name. But Constantinople, Constantine's city, was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, it was a new city. It was only built in 330 AD, long after the time of Jesus and the apostles. Early Christians, of course, had been centered in Jerusalem. We know that Paul and Barnabas had worked in Antioch, so Christians have been there a very long time. Early traditions said that the evangelist Mark, the one who wrote the second gospel in your New Testament, had lived in Alexandria and taught there for a while. So these 3 were very ancient Christian cities going back to the very first generation of Christianity. But Constantinople was a new city, and yet it was the imperial capital. So Constantinople became hugely important in early Christianity, since the bishops there were leaders in the church in the empire's capital. So they became known as the patriarchs of Constantinople. So you've just heard me refer to 4 men as patriarchs: the patriarch of Alexandria, Egypt, the patriarch of Jerusalem, the patriarch of Antioch, and the patriarch of Constantinople. And between the 4 of them, all the churches in the Eastern Roman Empire were answerable to one of those 4 guys. But there's one more patriarchate left, and that's in the West. And that's in Rome. There's Rome right there. Rome in Italy. And the bishops of Rome were in charge of all the churches in the Western world, in Italy, in North Africa, and even over in Gaul up here. All of those places, the Bishop of Rome was the one that people answered to in those churches. Now, the bishops of Rome got a nickname. The people there called them Papa, because they were sort of the big daddy over all the Christians in the Western Roman Empire. They became known as Papa. That has come down to us as the word Pope. Now, they weren't the only people called Pope. I have to tell you, the patriarchs of Alexandria are also known as Pope. So the leader of the Egyptian Christian church to this day is called Pope. The leader of Egyptian Christians today is called Pope Shenouda III. So just saying someone is the Pope doesn't mean it's necessarily the guy who lives in Rome. It could also be the fellow who lives in Alexandria, Egypt, and is the Pope of the Egyptian Christians. But for the Western world, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. And the bishops of Rome controlled all the churches in the Latin-speaking Western world. Now, it was not yet the case in the late 300s and 400s AD that everybody accepted the bishops of Rome, the popes in Rome, as the leaders of the Christian church. In fact, to this very day, people in the Eastern Roman world, these countries today, people who live in Greece and Bulgaria, the people who are Christians in Egypt, and millions of others, Russian Christians, do not recognize the Pope as the leader of the Christian church. Instead, they say there are 5 leaders of the Christian church, all 5 patriarchs. So, to this day, Christians are divided on that question. Roman Catholics would say the Pope is that of the entire Christian church all over the world, but Eastern Orthodox Christians consider the Patriarch of Constantinople to be the most senior leader. And people in Egypt consider the Pope in Alexandria to be the most senior Christian leader. So these divisions go back a very, very long way. It's only in the Western Church that people universally accepted the popes in Rome as the leaders of the Christian church. But I wanted to just mention that because when the Western Empire falls apart, one of the things that will keep some semblance of unity between the Frankish kingdom in Gaul and the Visigoths in Spain and the Germans who still lived in Germany and even the English in Britain and the Irish on the island of Ireland, one of the things that bound them together in the era after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, so after the late 400s, after the 500s, when all those Germanic kingdoms were set up, one of the things that bound Western civilization together was the papacy, the popes in Rome. The bishops of Rome were the one unifying figure that still existed. There were kings of all kinds all over the place, but the bishops of Rome, the popes in Rome, played a crucial role in holding the Western world in some semblance of unity. So that's extremely important. Now, before we adjourn from this lecture, I want to show you a couple of interesting buildings. So the Western world falls apart politically, and yet you still had a kind of cultural unity. This is a church built by the Visigoths in Spain. This was built by one of the kings of Spain under the Visigoths, and it is Santa Maria de Naranco in Oviedo, Spain. This was the capital of Visigoth Spain, the Visigothic kingdom, before the Muslims totally tore it to pieces. This church was built in the year 848. Now, this church is a style that is known as Romanesque. That means like the Romans, like the Romans. And look where I say it's like the Romans. Look at that arch. See that rounded arch, rounded arch, rounded arch, rounded arch. See those columns with the capitals on them? Rounded arch. So they were using a building style similar to that of ancient Rome. Now that's despite the fact that the Roman Empire in the West fell apart 400 years earlier. But culturally, the church kept Roman traditions somewhat alive. They still celebrated their worship in Latin. Even though the common people didn't speak Latin anymore, they were speaking an early form of what we call Spanish or French or Italian. And in Britain, they spoke English, which was not based on Latin at all. And yet in all these places, the architecture and the art for centuries would still echo ancient Rome. Have a look at this picture. This is an illustration from a manuscript, a handwritten document. It was produced around the year 800. And you can see there that this drawing, here it is in Latin. One fun thing you'll notice here, look at these symbols here. That E, recognize that E? How about that D there? That curvy M? Do those look familiar? It was in exactly this period, the late 700s and early 800s, that scribes in the Frankish lands developed lowercase letters. You remember all that stuff we read about Rome, all those videos we saw about ancient Rome. Every time you saw something written, it was in all capital letters. These are the guys at exactly this time who invented, look at that A, look at that E, look at that P, look at that little I there. These are the guys who invented lowercase letters. It's called Carolingian minuscule, and our lowercase letters are based on this style of writing. So we took our capitals from the ancient Romans and our lowercase letters from these scribes in the Carolingian Empire at exactly the time this document was produced. You can see they're still using forms that look a lot like capitals to us. That R there still looks like a capital R, but it's coming along. They're developing our lowercase letters. But the style of the drawing, hey, look at that. He's still wearing a toga, right? He's wearing a toga. So they're still echoing ancient Roman things. Nobody wore a toga in the around 800 anywhere except the emperor when he was trying to look Roman on purpose. But the church kept Roman traditions alive. So I'm going to turn the page. And one last little note about Christianity in the early period here. I think I got it one more page to go. Two more. There we go. These are early churches in Britain. Now that's not a very Roman-looking building, is it? That's not a very Roman-looking building at all. But you can see that church and the one above it. And these are monastic cells. Look at that cell there. You can see that just sort of curved stone. They look like piles of rock, but they're actually little bitty buildings with room enough for one monk to live in it. There's some up there on the top. You can see one pretty much intact. This is the kind of building that was being built in monasteries by Irish monks and the Irish missionaries who came to England. So this is early medieval architecture, very simple, but it's strong enough that it's still there 1,200 years later. How many buildings are we making today do you think will still be around 1,200 years from now? In any event, a little taste of early medieval Christianity. I'll see y'all soon. Bye.